In August 1942, Japanese soldiers stepped ashore on Guadalcanal, with expectations shaped by momentum. For 8 months, the empire had advanced almost without interruption. Islands had fallen quickly. Resistance, when encountered, had broken under speed and aggression. Guadalcanal was expected to follow the same pattern: another brief operation, another confirmation of superiority. The transition from beach to jungle took only minutes, and in those minutes, the war changed character. The canopy closed overhead, sealing out sky and distance alike. Sound dulled, then vanished. Orders spoken a few paces away dissolved into leaves and moisture. Movement became guesswork. Visibility collapsed to a few meters, sometimes less. The world narrowed until there was only green, shadow, and the sensation of being enclosed. Maps failed almost immediately. Carefully drawn routes and elevations bore little resemblance to the ground itself. The jungle ignored straight lines. Paths twisted, vanished, and reappeared without logic. Progress slowed to a crawl, measured not by objectives but by exhaustion. Units advanced, halted, and reformed without certainty of where they were or where others might be. The heat arrived early and stayed. Humidity pressed against lungs, turning breath into effort. Uniforms soaked through within the hour. Sweat blurred vision. Water supplies dwindled faster than expected. Bodies trained for discipline and endurance found themselves taxed before a single engagement had occurred. Doctrine offered no comfort. Formations disintegrated under vegetation. Drill assumed space, visibility, and command conditions the jungle refused to provide. Soldiers moved forward individually, bound by effort rather than coordination. Training felt distant, theoretical, suddenly irrelevant. The enemy remained unseen, yet presence was constant. Every sound carried weight. Every pause felt exposed. The jungle suggested observation without revealing its source. The war did not begin with gunfire. It announced itself through fatigue, confusion, and strain. And as the Japanese troops pushed inland, already tired and uncertain, they did not yet understand that night would bring something far worse: darkness without boundaries, and fear without rest. The moment Japanese units tried to turn inland movement into strategy, the island began to erase the very idea of a front line. Guadalcanal did not offer the clean geometry of a battlefield. There were no open fields to measure distance, no long sightlines to control. Under the canopy, direction itself became uncertain. A ridge that looked decisive on a map could be invisible in reality, hidden behind layers of vegetation and folded ground. Traditional lines of advance dissolved first. Columns entered the jungle as organized units, and emerged, if they emerged at all, as fragments. Files stretched and broke, men stopping to hack through vines or skirt swampy ground, each delay widening the gaps behind them. In this terrain, cohesion was not something maintained by discipline alone. It required visibility, and visibility was a privilege the jungle refused to grant. Units lost one another within minutes. A squad could move 20 meters and vanish behind a curtain of leaves. A platoon leader could look back and see only shadow where his rear elements should have been. The jungle did not need combat to scatter formations. It scattered them by simply existing. Communication failed at distances that would have seemed absurd in China or Malaya. Shouted orders were swallowed by damp air and foliage. Hand signals disappeared in the green. Runners sent with messages returned late, or not at all, and sometimes arrived at the wrong unit entirely. When orders did get through, they carried a quiet danger. They belonged to an earlier moment, written for a battlefield that no longer matched reality. The terrain negated drill. Japanese infantry training emphasized coordinated movement and control principles built on the assumption that men could see one another, align themselves, and maneuver as a body. Guadalcanal forced them into narrow paths and blind corners, turning formations into single-file lines, and confidence into a series of isolated decisions. American forces struggled too, but adaptation came unevenly and faster. Where movement was punished, they learned to hold ground. Where visibility was limited, they concentrated firepower, built defensive positions, and used the few open approaches as killing zones. On Guadalcanal, patience could be a weapon, and the jungle rewarded those who could wait. Japanese troops began to understand an unsettling truth. Visibility was not an advantage here. To be seen was to be targeted. To move was to announce yourself. The jungle did not simply conceal the enemy it made movement itself a liability. And as daylight faded, the island offered its final lesson for the day. If the jungle was confusing in sunlight, it became something else entirely in darkness. Near the equator, night does not arrive gradually, it falls. On Guadalcanal, daylight collapsed with sudden finality, as if a switch had been thrown. Within minutes, the jungle became a sealed space of shadow and sound, where depth vanished, and distance could no longer be judged. Shapes lost edges, direction lost meaning. With darkness came noise. The jungle spoke constantly, branches snapping, insects humming, unseen animals moving through undergrowth. Each sound felt deliberate, each pause felt unnatural. Soldiers strained to identify patterns, but none revealed themselves. The problem was not volume, it was ambiguity. Everything could be something, and nothing could be confirmed. Night patrols became psychological ordeals. Moving even a few meters required effort and courage disproportionate to the task. Men advanced slowly, rifles raised, senses stretched thin. Every step forward narrowed options for retreat. A patrol might return unchanged, or not return at all. There was no way to know which outcome awaited them when they set out. Sleep ceased to exist as a dependable state. Men rested in fragments minutes at a time, never fully surrendering consciousness. Bodies lay still while minds remained alert, listening. Fatigue accumulated without release. Eyes burned. Thoughts slowed. Judgment weakened. Night did not restore strength. It consumed it. Fire was often instinctive, rather than deliberate. A shadow shifted. A sound came too close. Rifles discharged into darkness without targets. Ammunition vanished quickly. The jungle absorbed bullets without response, offering no confirmation of success or failure. Silence afterward felt heavier than noise. Fear became ambient, no longer tied to a specific threat, but woven into every moment. It did not spike and fade, it lingered. Men learned to function within it rather than escape it. Courage, in this environment, was not dramatic, it was repetitive. By the end of those first nights, something fundamental had changed. This was not the war they had prepared for. It was not a contest of maneuver or decisive blows. It was a campaign of erosion, where the enemy did not need to attack to cause damage. As dawn returned, pale and uncertain, the jungle revealed nothing of what had moved within it, and the soldiers understood, perhaps for the first time, that Guadalcanal was not simply a place where battles would occur. It was a battlefield that never slept. By the summer of 1942, the Imperial Japanese Army carried into battle a powerful inheritance: success. From Malaya to the Philippines, from Hong Kong to Singapore, campaigns had unfolded with startling speed. Opponents had fallen back or collapsed outright. Each victory reinforced a simple conclusion that audacity, discipline, and momentum could decide wars before resistance fully formed. Speed had become doctrine, aggression had become identity. Japanese planning assumed that initiative, once seized, would never need to be surrendered. The enemy, faced with relentless pressure, would lose cohesion first. This belief was not theoretical. It had been proven repeatedly. Across varied terrain and against different foes, victory had become familiar. Jungle warfare, in particular, appeared to favor Japanese strengths. Training emphasized endurance, self-sufficiency, and obedience under hardship. Officers believed their troops were better suited than Western armies to operate without roads, without comfort, and without pause. The jungle was not feared. It was accepted as an environment where discipline would separate the prepared from the weak. Guadalcanal was therefore judged through the lens of past success. Strategically, it seemed peripheral, an outpost rather than a fulcrum. Commanders expected limited opposition and assumed that any American presence could be overwhelmed quickly, before logistics or reinforcements could alter the balance. The island was not ignored, but it was not respected. Morale, Japanese leadership believed, would compensate for difficulty. Hardship had never been decisive before. Hunger, fatigue, and disease were viewed as tests of spirit rather than limiting factors. If soldiers believed in the righteousness of their mission, they would endure. If they endured, victory would follow. This faith in morale bordered on certainty. Doctrine remained unchanged. Night attacks, infiltration, and aggressive forward movement were emphasized exactly as before. There was no reason, commanders thought, to revise methods that had brought such consistent success. Adaptation was considered unnecessary, even risky. The problem was never doctrine, it was execution. Confidence moved ashore with the troops. It was present in their posture, in their expectations, in the way orders were issued. They did not believe they were entering a fundamentally different kind of war. They believed they were repeating a familiar one, under more difficult conditions perhaps, but toward the same inevitable conclusion. What they did not yet understand was that victories can mislead, as easily as defeats instruct. The lessons learned in earlier campaigns had been correct, until they weren't. And on Guadalcanal, the environment, the enemy, and time itself were about to test whether confidence could survive without adjustment. The first collisions between belief and reality were already forming quietly, invisibly in the jungle ahead. Japanese infantry doctrine entered the campaign with confidence earned elsewhere. It emphasized night attack, infiltration, and the moral shock of sudden contact. Darkness was meant to level disparities in firepower. Close movement would negate artillery. Surprise, once achieved, would fracture resistance. On paper, the jungle appeared to favor all of it. At first glance, Guadalcanal seemed almost designed for such methods. Visibility was limited, paths were narrow, cover was everywhere. Officers believed that disciplined troops, moving silently at night, could slip past American positions and strike from within. The environment looked like an ally. In practice, coordination collapsed almost immediately. Units that set out together separated within minutes, slowed by terrain that refused uniform movement. Timetables dissolved, bearings drifted, signals failed. A maneuver planned as a single, decisive thrust arrived instead as disconnected fragments, each unaware of the other's position or progress. Without mutual support, advance became isolation. Squads pressed forward believing adjacent units were near, only to discover later that no one had followed. Attacks arrived piecemeal rather than en masse. Momentum, so critical to doctrine, evaporated in the undergrowth. The jungle did not permit synchronization. It permitted only persistence. Direction was the next casualty. Night attacks lost alignment, then purpose. Men emerged from foliage, uncertain whether they were closing on enemy lines or circling their own. Contact, when it occurred, was often accidental rather than planned. Surprise existed, but without exploitation. Confusion followed each brief success. Timing failed as well. Attacks launched too early met alert defenders. Those arriving late found positions already reinforced. What doctrine required, simultaneity, coordination, pressure, was precisely what the environment denied. The jungle scattered intention as thoroughly as it scattered sound. As planning unraveled, courage filled the void. Individual bravery became the means of advance. Soldiers pressed forward because stopping felt worse than continuing. Acts of determination replaced structured movement. Valor was abundant. Control was not. Losses followed predictably. Isolated units encountered prepared fire. Attacks stalled against machine guns guarding narrow approaches. Without supporting elements, withdrawal proved as dangerous as advance. Casualties mounted without decisive gain, and the reasons were not immediately clear to those bearing the cost. Doctrine had not failed because it lacked discipline or spirit. It failed because it assumed conditions that did not exist. Guadalcanal did not reward infiltration, it punished it. The jungle accepted bravery, but it did not amplify it. What had once been a strength now exposed a vulnerability, and as Japanese commanders prepared the next assaults, convinced that greater resolve would solve the problem, the environment waited unchanged, indifferent, and ready to repeat the lesson. Japanese planning for Guadalcanal rested on a single assumption: speed would solve everything. The campaign was expected to be brief, decisive, and self-contained. Victory would come before supply became a constraint. In that belief, logistics were treated not as a foundation of operations, but as a temporary inconvenience that success would soon make irrelevant. Supply lines to Guadalcanal were thin from the outset. The island lay at the far edge of Japanese naval reach, exposed to air and sea interdiction. Reinforcements and provisions depended on narrow shipping windows and contested waters. There was little margin for delay, and no depth to absorb disruption. The system functioned only as long as nothing went wrong. Things went wrong quickly. Naval losses in the surrounding seas shattered schedules and expectations. Transports were sunk or turned back. Escorts were diverted to higher priorities. Supplies that had been calculated precisely for advancing units never arrived. Those that did often came late, incomplete, or damaged. The jungle consumed packaging as readily as it consumed strength. Food shortages appeared within weeks. Rations were cut quietly at first, then openly. Rice ran out. Substitutes were scavenged from the environment, but the jungle offered little that could sustain an army. Weight fell off bodies already strained by heat and disease. Hunger slowed movement, dulled thinking, and hollowed endurance. Combat effectiveness eroded without a single engagement. Ammunition became a resource to be guarded rather than expended. Fire discipline tightened, not as a tactical choice, but out of necessity. Soldiers learned to count rounds, to hesitate before firing, to endure pressure rather than respond with force. The psychological effect was as damaging as the physical one. Confidence drained away with each withheld shot. Disease spread faster than orders. Malaria, dysentery, and fungal infections flourished in the damp heat. Medical supplies were insufficient, evacuation nearly impossible. Men remained with their units long after they should have been removed from the line, becoming burdens rather than assets. Commanders watched strength disappear without understanding how to stop it. The structure of the campaign began to collapse inward. Units planned operations without knowing what supplies would exist tomorrow. Attacks were postponed not for tactical reasons, but because men lacked the energy to move. Decision-making narrowed to the immediate hour, then the immediate minute. The future ceased to be a planning horizon. What had been designed as an offensive campaign began to consume itself. Hunger weakened discipline, disease erased formations, ammunition scarcity reshaped tactics. The jungle did not need to fight, it only needed to wait. And as Japanese command continued to focus on attacking the enemy ahead, a more decisive threat was tightening from behind. An invisible siege, closing slowly, carried by the simple absence of food, medicine, and time. By the early weeks of the campaign, the jungle had begun to inflict casualties without firing a shot. Malaria spread silently through units, carried by insects no one could see or stop. Dysentery followed, draining strength day by day. Fungal infections rotted skin and feet, turning boots into instruments of pain. Men reported for duty already diminished, their bodies betraying them before the enemy ever appeared. Medical supplies were never adequate. Quinine ran short. Bandages were reused. Field treatment became improvisation rather than care. Evacuation, once routine in earlier campaigns, was now rare. Sick soldiers remained with their units because there was nowhere else for them to go. Illness became something to endure, not something to cure. The jungle concealed more than enemy movement. It concealed decay. Wounds refused to heal in the damp heat. Clothing never dried. Equipment rusted, warped, or vanished into the undergrowth. The environment erased the distinction between combat damage and natural deterioration. Everything broke down at the same slow, relentless pace. Weight loss became visible. Faces hollowed. Uniforms hung loose on frames that had once been strong. Calorie intake dropped far below what sustained fighting required. Hunger was constant, not sharp but persistent, a background condition that dulled energy and shortened patience. Physical power ebbed quietly, unnoticed until it was gone. Strength eroded before combat ever occurred. Men struggled to carry weapons they had once handled easily. Marches shortened, reaction times slowed. The capacity for sudden effort so essential in close combat faded first. By the time fighting began, many units were already operating below their limits. Morale changed character. Early confidence, built on victory and belief, gave way to something narrower and more durable. Endurance replaced optimism. Soldiers no longer spoke of outcomes. They spoke of making it through the day. Courage was measured not in attack, but in persistence. Yet adaptation did occur, small and uncelebrated. Units learned to pace themselves. Men shared what little food remained. Rest was taken whenever possible, regardless of schedule. Survival skills, finding water, avoiding rot, recognizing symptoms, became as important as marksmanship. Innovation was not technological, it was human. On Guadalcanal, the line between soldier and environment blurred. Men fought the enemy when they could, and the jungle at all other times. Victory was no longer the immediate aim, survival was. And as Japanese units clung to existence under these conditions, Another realization began to surface quietly, reluctantly. The Americans they faced were not retreating. They were entrenching, growing stronger by the day. The jungle had weakened one side. It had bought time for the other. As the campaign dragged on, Japanese forces began to confront an uncomfortable reality. The enemy they faced on Guadalcanal was not behaving as expected. American units did not seek sweeping advances through the jungle. They did not pursue aggressively into terrain that erased advantage. Instead, they dug in, consolidated, and waited. Firepower became the foundation of American defense. Positions were selected not for elegance, but for control over river crossings, ridgelines, and the few narrow approaches the jungle allowed. Movement was minimized. Fields of fire were maximized. The environment was not something to be conquered, but something to be shaped. Japanese attacks increasingly met prepared resistance. Where earlier encounters had relied on surprise and shock, defenders now anticipated infiltration routes. Listening posts, wire, and overlapping fire zones turned night movement into exposure. Surprise, once the decisive edge, began to lose its force. Machine guns dominated the landscape. Set to cover choke points that could not be bypassed, they transformed narrow jungle paths into corridors of denial. Attacks compressed into these routes by necessity, not choice. Courage carried men forward, but fire decided how far they could go. The jungle magnified defensive weapons more than offensive intent. Artillery added another dimension. Shells did not merely target troops, they reshaped terrain. Jungle clearings were blasted open, trees shattered, undergrowth flattened. What had been concealment became exposure. Each bombardment altered the ground, favoring those who already knew where to aim. The jungle, once fluid and uncertain, began to acquire fixed reference points, almost all of them hostile. With each failed attack, the effectiveness of surprise diminished further. American units learned patterns of movement, preferred approaches, habitual timing. The jungle recorded these lessons silently. Paths once useful became predictable. What had worked before now drew immediate response. Tactics that had succeeded in earlier campaigns failed here, not because they lacked bravery or discipline, but because the opponent refused to fight on expected terms. The Americans did not chase infiltration units into darkness. They held their ground, trusted their weapons, and allowed the environment to do part of the work for them. Japanese adaptation came slowly. Reports acknowledged stronger defenses, heavier firepower, increasing difficulty. Yet proposed changes were cautious, incremental. There was reluctance to abandon methods that had defined earlier success. To adapt fully would have required accepting that the balance of advantage had shifted and that admission carried strategic consequences beyond the island. Meanwhile, the enemy continued to learn. Defensive positions improved. Coordination between infantry, artillery, and air support tightened. Each Japanese assault, even when repelled, revealed information that could be used against the next. Attrition was not one-sided, but its meaning was asymmetrical. By the time Japanese commanders fully grasped the nature of the opponent before them, the opportunity to adjust had narrowed. The enemy would not stand still. He would not be drawn out. He would not yield ground cheaply. He would wait, absorb, and respond, with force measured not in momentum, but in sustainability. What had begun as a contest of initiative was becoming a test of endurance under firepower, and endurance, on Guadalcanal, increasingly favored the side that could remain supplied, reinforced, and patient. The lesson was becoming clear, but clarity does not always arrive in time to be useful. By the middle months of the campaign, losses were mounting without the clarity of battle. There were no sweeping offensives to mark progress, no decisive engagements to explain the numbers. Men disappeared from rosters quietly, first a few, then many claimed by sickness, hunger, exhaustion, or wounds sustained in brief, inconclusive clashes. The war advanced without spectacle, measured in absence rather than movement. Reinforcements did arrive, but they came diminished. Long transport voyages under constant threat took their toll before soldiers ever reached land. Many arrived already malnourished, seasick, or weakened by disease. Equipment was incomplete. Ammunition was limited. Units meant to restore strength instead absorbed it, drawing from supplies that barely sustained those already ashore. Japanese command struggled to understand what was happening on Guadalcanal. The jungle obstructed observation as effectively as it blocked movement. There were no clear front lines to report, no reliable metrics to assess progress. Engagements were scattered and brief, offering little insight into overall conditions. The island refused to be read from afar. Reports sent up the chain understated the crisis. Partly this was habit, an instinct to emphasize resolve and minimize weakness. Partly it was ignorance. Officers in the field often lacked a complete picture themselves, seeing only their immediate surroundings. Losses were described as manageable. Morale was reported as firm. The words traveled faster than reality. Meanwhile, units continued to dissolve. Starvation hollowed bodies. Disease thinned ranks. Platoons shrank to squads. Squads faded into clusters of men sharing a last ration, a last cigarette, a last expectation of relief. Formal organization persisted on paper long after it ceased to exist in the jungle. The enemy remained strangely abstract. American positions were encountered, fought, and avoided, but rarely seen in total. There was no sense of their full strength or intention. Artillery fire came from unseen batteries. Machine guns spoke from concealed ground. The opposition felt omnipresent, yet undefined, like the jungle itself. This abstraction altered the psychology of the campaign. Men did not feel defeated by an opponent so much as worn down by conditions. Effort produced no visible result. Sacrifice yielded no clear progress. Attrition lacked narrative. And without narrative, endurance became harder to sustain. The war turned invisible and relentless. It did not advance in bursts, but in pressure. Each day reduced strength slightly more than the last. Each night erased what little recovery daylight had allowed. There was no moment when the situation clearly collapsed, only the growing realization that it was collapsing constantly. For Japanese command, the danger was not merely the losses themselves, but their invisibility. A crisis that cannot be seen, cannot be confronted directly. And while reports continued to speak of resolve and opportunity, the jungle told a different story, one written not in victories or defeats, but in steady, irreversible decline. Somewhere between the truth on the ground and the confidence in headquarters, the campaign crossed a threshold. What remained uncertain was whether anyone was yet prepared to acknowledge it. The major Japanese offensives on Guadalcanal were conceived as decisive moments, final efforts meant to break the stalemate and restore initiative. Commanders believed that concentration, even under adverse conditions, could still produce a breakthrough. If enough men were committed, if enough courage was expended, the enemy would yield. They did not. Repeated assaults met the same quiet resistance. Allied positions, anchored to rivers, ridges, and narrow approaches, absorbed the attacks without collapsing. The jungle funneled movement into predictable corridors, turning advance into exposure. Where maneuver might have succeeded elsewhere, terrain here denied it completely. Numerical effort proved irrelevant. Larger forces could not deploy fully. Reinforcements only thickened congestion along trails and ravines. Men advanced shoulder to shoulder not by design, but because there was nowhere else to go. The jungle compressed strength instead of amplifying it. Firepower dominated these choke points. American machine guns, mortars, and artillery had clear arcs over the few viable approaches. Fields of fire were measured carefully, rehearsed repeatedly. Each Japanese attack entered zones already mapped by sight and sound. The jungle that had concealed movement now betrayed it. Attacks ended not in breakthrough, but in exhaustion. Units pressed forward until strength failed, then stalled under fire they could not silence. Withdrawal was as costly as advance. Casualties mounted without altering the line. What should have been climactic moments dissolved into attritional episodes, bloody, brief, and inconclusive. Losses could no longer be replaced. Reinforcements were scarce. Supplies were thinner still. Each failed assault reduced not only manpower, but possibility. The margin for error vanished. There would be no second wave strong enough to repeat the effort. Momentum shifted quietly. There was no dramatic reversal, no single day that marked the change. It arrived gradually, as the initiative slipped away unnoticed. Allied positions grew stronger. Japanese attacks grew shorter, weaker, less coordinated. Time itself began to favor one side. Strategic reality intruded where belief had held firm. Guadalcanal was no longer an opportunity, it was a liability. Every day spent attacking consumed strength needed elsewhere. Every casualty weakened the broader war effort. The island refused to yield the reward its capture was meant to secure. What had begun as an offensive campaign now hovered at the edge of recognition. The possibility that persistence was no longer courage, but cost. The jungle had not merely resisted breakthrough. It had revealed the limits of force applied without advantage. And as commanders weighed whether to press on or reconsider entirely, another truth pressed closer, one far harder to accept than defeat in battle. The Navy, once expected to sustain the fight, was running out of ways to do so. The fate of the Japanese army on Guadalcanal had always depended on the sea. From the beginning, the campaign assumed naval control would compensate for distance, terrain, and logistics. Ships would deliver food, ammunition, and reinforcements. If pressure increased, the Navy would adjust. It was the final guarantee beneath every operational plan. That guarantee began to erode in the waters surrounding the island. Naval engagements throughout late 1942 imposed a cost the Imperial Japanese Navy could not easily absorb. Destroyers were lost, transports were sunk, night runs fast, improvised, dangerous replaced scheduled supply convoys. What arrived came in fragments, a few boxes of ammunition, sacks of rice thrown overboard, drums washed ashore by chance. The margin for sustainment narrowed to almost nothing. Resupply was no longer reliable. It was occasional. Within headquarters, evacuation entered discussion quietly, almost reluctantly. It was not framed as retreat, but as preservation of men, of ships, of future capability. Yet the very consideration marked a profound shift. Guadalcanal had begun as an offensive necessity. Now it was being weighed against broader survival. Command resisted acknowledging failure. Orders continued to emphasize resolve and persistence. To concede the island was to concede initiative in the Pacific, and such an admission carried political and strategic weight far beyond the jungle. So the language of attack remained, even as the means to execute it vanished. On the ground, troops continued to fight without relief. There were no rotations, no reserves, no promise of reinforcement. Units held positions simply because they had nowhere else to go. Days blurred together. The distinction between holding ground and waiting to be overwhelmed became increasingly thin. Hunger replaced tactical concern. Men thought first about food, then about ammunition, and only then about maneuver. Plans were judged by whether soldiers had the strength to execute them at all. Attacks were postponed not because they were unsound, but because bodies could no longer move. War was reduced to metabolism. The campaign's spirit turned defensive long before orders made it official. Soldiers dug in, not to prepare attacks, but to endure bombardment. Movement became minimal. Risk was avoided when possible. Survival instincts quietly overruled offensive doctrine. The jungle, once something to be crossed, became something to hide within. Withdrawal, when it came, felt inevitable precisely because it had been delayed so long. By the time the decision hardened, the cost had already been paid in starvation, disease, and attrition. Evacuation plans were shaped by scarcity. How many ships remained? How many men could still walk? How many nights could be risked at sea? The Navy could no longer save the army because it could no longer reach it in strength. Sea control, once assumed, had become contested and costly. Guadalcanal demanded resources Japan could not spare without endangering the wider war. What remained was not the question of whether to leave, but how much could be salvaged before the island claimed everything else. And as preparations for withdrawal began under the cover of darkness, another realization settled in one that would outlast the campaign itself. Guadalcanal had not merely been lost, it had changed the balance of the war. By the time understanding arrived, its value had already diminished. Japanese leadership began to grasp the true cost of Guadalcanal, not through a single report or defeat, but through accumulation losses that could not be hidden, requests that could no longer be met, and silence where confidence had once existed. The campaign was no longer misbehaving. It was exposing a flaw in assumption. The jungle had rewritten operational logic. It had shown that control of terrain could outweigh initiative, that endurance could defeat aggression, and that logistics once considered secondary were decisive. The lessons were stark, but they were also late. They arrived after manpower had been consumed, after ships had been sunk, after opportunity had slipped away. Honor had long guided decision-making, shaping expectations of sacrifice and resolve. On Guadalcanal, honor met arithmetic. Attrition did not reward bravery, it measured it and erased it. Losses accumulated without distinction between the valiant and the exhausted. The cost of persistence now exceeded its meaning. Survival replaced conquest as the immediate priority. Orders shifted in tone and substance. Language once devoted to attack softened into instruction for movement, concealment, and withdrawal. The objective was no longer to seize ground, but to preserve what remained of the force. This change did not come easily. It required abandoning not only an island, but an idea of how the war was meant to be fought. The shift from attack to escape was a psychological rupture. Soldiers who had been told to advance now received instructions to endure, then to disappear. Evacuation plans were framed as temporary measures, but few believed they were. The jungle, once treated as an obstacle, had become the reason to leave. This decision marked a strategic turning point larger than the island itself. Guadalcanal was the first campaign where Japan committed substantial forces and failed to reclaim the initiative. It was the first time that withdrawal was chosen not to prepare a stronger return, but because no such return was possible. The implications extended beyond the Solomon Islands. Resources redirected elsewhere were already insufficient. Allied production continued to grow. Japanese forces, once defined by momentum, now faced a war of reaction. The initiative so carefully cultivated through early victories had passed across the ocean and would not return. Understanding, when it came, was clear-eyed but constrained. Leadership recognized what had gone wrong, but recognition could not restore strength already lost. The jungle had not merely defeated units. It had altered the balance of the Pacific War by revealing the limits of doctrine, logistics, and belief. For the men still on the island, these realizations offered little comfort. They shaped orders, not conditions. Hunger did not recede. Disease did not pause. Evacuation, when it occurred, was partial and perilous. Many would not leave. What remained was the knowledge that Guadalcanal had been a threshold. Before it, Japan advanced by confidence and speed. After it, every operation would be shaped by caution, scarcity, and defense. The initiative had changed hands quietly, without ceremony. And once lost, it would define everything that followed. When the campaign finally receded into history, its cost was difficult to summarize in traditional terms. There had been no single, decisive battle to explain the losses on Guadalcanal, no dramatic collapse. Instead, thousands of Japanese soldiers perished quietly, dispersed across jungle paths, riverbanks, and abandoned positions. Many died without ever seeing the enemy who had defeated them. Disease claimed more lives than combat. Malaria weakened bodies already starved of nutrition. Dysentery drained what little strength remained. Infections turned minor, wounds fatal. The jungle did not distinguish between frontline and rear. It reached everyone equally, relentlessly, and without pause. Medical records, when they existed, lagged far behind reality. Those who survived carried damage that did not fade with evacuation. Severe weight loss altered bodies permanently. Untreated illnesses left chronic weakness. Feet ruined by rot and fungus never fully healed. The jungle's toll extended beyond the campaign itself, following men home as lingering pain, shortened endurance, and silent reminders of what had been endured. Entire units ceased to exist as formations. Platoons dissolved into handfuls of men. Companies became names on paper without physical presence. Command structures collapsed not through defeat, but through absence. When evacuation came, it removed individuals, not armies. What returned was not a force, but fragments. Within the Japanese army, Guadalcanal became a warning spoken cautiously, sometimes indirectly. Officers referenced it as a lesson in logistics, in overreach, in the dangers of underestimating terrain and supply. Yet the lessons were absorbed unevenly. Some commands adapted, others clung to familiar doctrine, believing Guadalcanal an exception rather than a precedent. The campaign's meaning was contested even as its cost was undeniable. For some, it represented sacrifice endured with honor. For others, it exposed systemic failures that bravery could not overcome. The absence of a clear narrative made reckoning difficult. There was no single mistake to correct, no enemy maneuver to blame. What remained were scars that resisted accounting. Losses could be counted, but not fully explained. The jungle left few markers, few graves, few reminders visible from the air. Silence settled where formations had once moved. Nature reclaimed positions as if they had never been occupied at all. Yet the silence was deceptive. Guadalcanal echoed through planning rooms and training manuals, through cautious orders and revised expectations. It shaped how future campaigns were approached, even when its lessons were not openly acknowledged. The cost of Guadalcanal was not measured solely in bodies, but in confidence eroded and assumptions broken. It marked the moment when endurance replaced inevitability and survival replaced ambition. And as the war pressed on elsewhere, carrying new names and new battles, the island remained quiet, overgrown, and indifferent, holding the memory of an army that had entered expecting victory and left behind something far harder to replace. In the aftermath of the campaign, the jungle of Guadalcanal stood as more than a battlefield. It became a measure, not of courage or sacrifice, but of preparation and of its absence. The island had exposed limits that victories elsewhere had concealed. Doctrine, refined through success, had encountered conditions it could not bend. Japanese military thought had long emphasized spirit, discipline, and decisive action. These qualities mattered, and on Guadalcanal they were present in abundance. But the jungle revealed a harder truth. Courage could not replace logistics. Determination could not move food where ships could not sail. Endurance could not cure disease or replenish ammunition. Valor, however sincere, could not compensate for structural weakness. The environment itself emerged as an active combatant. Heat, rain, insects, and decay imposed continuous pressure, shaping outcomes as decisively as any opposing force. The jungle rewarded patience and supply. It punished haste and assumption. It offered concealment, then stripped it away. It accepted movement, then made movement lethal. In this war, nature did not sit on the sidelines. It chose. Planning assumptions collapsed under sustained contact with reality. The expectation of rapid victory had justified thin supply lines. Confidence in doctrine had discouraged adaptation. Faith in morale had delayed reconsideration. Each assumption was logical in isolation. Together, they formed a structure too brittle to survive prolonged strain. War proved indifferent to intention. Guadalcanal did not respond to belief, or to honor, or to past achievement. It responded only to what could be sustained day after day. Men fought with commitment. Leaders issued orders with conviction. The island measured only results, and it returned them without emotion. From this indifference emerged a stark lesson. Adaptation was no longer optional. It was not a matter of improvement, but of survival. Forces that learned to adjust to terrain, to supply, to time, endured. Those that did not were ground down quietly, regardless of their willingness to sacrifice. The Pacific War changed character here. What followed Guadalcanal was no longer a sequence of rapid expansions driven by surprise and momentum. It became a prolonged struggle defined by logistics, production, and attrition. Control of sea lanes mattered more than audacity. Sustainability outweighed initiative. Time itself became a weapon. For Japan, this transformation arrived too late to be shaped on favorable terms. The lessons of Guadalcanal informed future decisions, but they could not reverse the balance already shifting. Adaptation occurred within narrowing margins, under increasing pressure, against an opponent whose resources continued to grow. The jungle had not merely defeated an army, it had rewritten the conditions of the war. It demonstrated that modern conflict, fought across vast distances and hostile environments, rewarded preparation over passion and structure over impulse. Guadalcanal offered no grand monument to mark this change. There was no single moment of revelation. The lesson emerged slowly, through exhaustion and loss, until it could no longer be ignored. And as the Pacific War moved on toward new islands, new battles, and greater destruction, it carried with it the quiet legacy of this place, the understanding that war does not yield to belief, it yields only to reality. They arrived, Noblesse Guadalcanal, prepared for battle. They carried rifles, doctrine, and confidence shaped by victory. They expected resistance that could be located, engaged, and overcome. What they encountered instead was something slower, quieter, and far less negotiable. The jungle did not confront them all at once. It worked gradually. It stripped away certainty first about distance, about direction, about time. Then it took strength. One day at a time, through heat, hunger, and disease. What could not be seen could not be challenged directly. What could not be challenged could only be endured. Victory was not denied through a single defeat. There was no decisive moment when the campaign clearly failed. It eroded. Attrition replaced confrontation. Strength faded without spectacle. Men weakened not because they lacked courage, but because courage alone could not sustain bodies without food, medicine, or rest. Guadalcanal taught its lesson quietly. It did not announce itself with catastrophe. It waited. It allowed assumptions to operate until they exhausted themselves. Doctrine was tested not in theory, but in practice, day after day, night after night, until its limits became unavoidable. What emerged was a clearer understanding of war's nature. Conflict was not merely a contest between armies. It was a struggle conducted within environments that shape every decision and outcome. Terrain was not passive. Climate was not incidental. Supply was not secondary. On Guadalcanal, the environment became an actor with agency equal to any opposing force. Strategy failed where reality was ignored. Plans built on speed collapsed when speed could not be sustained. Faith and morale faltered when bodies failed. Confidence drawn from past success offered no protection against conditions that rendered success irrelevant. The jungle did not punish belief. It simply refused to acknowledge it. For the soldiers who endured the campaign, this realization came without language to frame it. They felt it in fatigue that never lifted, in hunger that never eased, in nights that offered no rest. They adapted where they could, endured where they must, and survived where circumstances allowed. Many did not. For command, the lesson arrived as loss measured not only in men, but in momentum. Guadalcanal marked the point where initiative slipped away and did not return. After it, the war would be fought on different terms, longer, harsher, and defined by resources rather than audacity. The island itself offered no judgment. It absorbed everything and reclaimed what was left. Positions vanished, paths closed, silence returned. The jungle did what it had always done: grow, decay, and endure. In the end, the story of Guadalcanal is not one of cowardice or failure of will. It is a story of mismatch between expectation and reality, between belief and condition. The Japanese soldiers who landed there were ready to fight an enemy. What they were not prepared for was erosion. They came ready to fight a war. The jungle gave them a different one: